The envelope hit the counter like a blade. Lee Tae-hyun didn't need to open it. The seal alone told him everything. 6 months of peace, gone in one breath. "This one's not from the lawyers," Naomi said, turning it over, dread flickering across her face. Kian froze mid-kick, the soccer ball rolling toward Mochi's water bowl, sensing something shift before either parent said a word. Tae-hyun tore it open. 4 sentences. 1 name. Director Baek Sung-ho. "They're questioning Kian's legitimacy," he said quietly. "Whether my own son has any claim to what I built." Naomi's eyes hardened instantly. "I'm not running again. Not this time. Not ever again. Because the man who tried to destroy this family once was already sitting in a prison cell. But someone else had been waiting, watching quietly from inside the very boardroom where Tae-hyun once bled the truth in front of everyone. And this time, they weren't coming for him. They were coming for his son. Welcome to AfroK Romance Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from and what time it is over there. Before we begin, if you can't get enough of Afro-Korean Mafia Boss romances, you'll love my Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. Simply click the link in the description, or if you're watching on a TV, pause the video and open your phone's camera and point it at the QR code on your screen. It takes just seconds. Now, let's enjoy today's unforgettable story. The envelope came by courier at 8:15 in the morning, addressed formally to Chairman Lee Tae-hyun, and it landed on the kitchen counter of the penthouse between a plate of half-eaten toast and a small plastic bowl that Mochi, the promised one dog, small breed, had already learned to sit beside with theatrical patience whenever food was involved. Naomi was the one who picked it up first. She had grown, over the past 6 months, into something she genuinely hadn't expected to become. A woman who understood the particular weight of formal Baekho Group stationery, the way she once understood the particular weight of a Pantone swatch. Instantly, instinctively, and always with a small flicker of dread. "This one's not from the lawyers," she said, turning it over in her hands. "It's board stationery. The old kind. The kind your father used to use. Not the new letterhead." "Give me a second," Tae-hyun said, catching Kian mid-kick, before the ball could meet Mochi's water bowl for the 2nd time that week. "Buddy, not in here. We've discussed this. You said outside is boring because it's raining," Kian pointed out, with the flat, unshakable logic that Tae-hyun was slowly learning to recognize as entirely his own, inherited whole and undiluted, the same way his eyes had been. "So I'm practicing where it's not raining." "The logic is airtight," Naomi said, not looking up from the envelope. "I can't argue with it. You're supposed to be on my side," Tae-hyun said. "I'm on the side of whoever's right," Naomi said. "That's you maybe 40% of the time, statistically." Kian laughed at that, with the particular delight of a child who has just watched an adult get outmaneuvered by another adult. And for a moment, standing in his own kitchen with his son laughing and his wife holding an envelope he hadn't opened yet, Tae-hyun felt something settle in his chest that he still, 6 months in, hadn't entirely gotten used to feeling. Something ordinary, something that didn't require calculation. Then he took the envelope from Naomi's hands, and the moment he saw the seal on the back, the ordinary feeling left the room the way warmth leaves a house the instant a window breaks somewhere upstairs. It was the seal of the Baekho Group's founding council. The same 8 men who had built the company alongside his father 30 years earlier. The same men who had sat, mostly silent, in that boardroom 6 months ago, when Tae-hyun stood in front of all of them and told them exactly what his cousin had done. He hadn't heard from most of them directly since. They had voted, in the aftermath of Dae-sung's arrest, to formally strip him of his directorship and to publicly affirm Tae-hyun's leadership of the company. It had felt, at the time, like a closed matter. He opened the envelope standing at the kitchen counter and read 4 sentences that told him it had never been closed at all. The council requests a formal meeting regarding the matter of succession clarity within the Baekho Group, given recent developments concerning the chairman's household. This meeting has been called at the request of Director Baek Sung-ho, founding council member. Attendance is expected within 7 days. This is not, at this time, a public matter. Naomi watched his face change, the way she'd learned to watch it over the past 7 years. First when they'd fallen in love, then when they'd lost each other, then when they'd found their way back through fire she still occasionally dreamed about. She knew every version of that face by now. This was a version she hadn't seen since the night the security footage first came back with On's photograph on it. "What is it?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was a request. "Director Baek," Tae-hyun said slowly, reading the letter again like the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming if he gave them enough time. "He's calling a formal council meeting about succession." "Succession of what?" "Of me," Tae-hyun said. "Of this. Of whether Kian has a legitimate claim to inherit anything at all, given the, quote, recent developments concerning my household." Quote, the kitchen went very quiet. Even Kian, who had gone back to gently rolling the ball back and forth with his foot in a compromise negotiated silently with his own conscience, looked up at the sudden change in the air. "Who's Director Baek?" Naomi asked carefully. "He's been on the founding council since before I was born," Tae-hyun said. "He was one of my father's oldest partners. He voted to strip Dae-sung of his position 6 months ago. He shook my hand afterward and told me my father would have been proud. And now he's the one calling a meeting about whether your son is legitimate enough to exist in this family." Tae-hyun set the letter down on the counter, very carefully, the way a man sets down something he suspects might be about to detonate. "Yes," he said. "Now he is." It took Tae-hyun most of that afternoon, after Naomi had taken Kian to his after-school soccer practice, which he now attended with a genuine competitiveness that made Do-yoon laugh every single time, to understand exactly what he was dealing with. He called Do-yoon first, because in 6 months of marriage and fatherhood, some things had not changed at all, and one of them was that Do-yoon was still the first phone call Tae-hyun made whenever the ground shifted under his feet. "I need everything you can find on Director Baek Sung-ho," Tae-hyun said, standing on the same balcony where he had once told Naomi that whatever came next was worth all of it. The city stretching gray and rain-washed beneath him. Financials, business relationships, anything he's touched in the last 10 years that connects, even loosely, to Dae-sung's operations. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the specific kind of pause Do-yoon reserved for moments when he was recalibrating how worried he was allowed to sound out loud. "Sir, you know I love a good conspiracy theory as much as the next man. But Director Baek voted against Dae-sung. Publicly. On record. He's the reason the vote to strip him was unanimous instead of split." "I know," Tae-hyun said. "That's exactly what's bothering me. Explain that to me, like I'm not currently standing in a parking garage holding 2 coffees and mild confusion. 6 months ago, Director Baek didn't hesitate for 1 second to throw Dae-sung to the wolves the moment the evidence came out," Tae-hyun said. "A man who spent 30 years building loyalty inside an organization like this doesn't burn a friendship that fast, unless he already knew exactly how bad it could get for him personally if he didn't distance himself first." Do-yoon was quiet for a moment. You think he knew, before it came out? I think, Tae-hyun said slowly, working through it the way he worked through every problem. Out loud, layer by layer. The same habit Naomi had once described as watching someone solve an equation in real time. That Dae-sung didn't build a decade-long fraud entirely by himself. Shell companies with 3 layers of ownership don't run themselves quietly for 10 years without someone at the top signing off on audits that should have caught it. Someone senior enough that questions never got asked. You think Baek was profiting alongside him? I think Baek was smart enough to jump off the boat the exact second it started sinking, and loud enough about it that no one thought to check whether he'd been on the boat in the first place, Tae-hyun said. And now, 6 months later, with the forensic audit still technically open, with investigators still occasionally finding new threads in the paperwork, he's the one calling a meeting about my son's legitimacy. That's not concern for the family legacy, Do-yoon. That's a man trying to change the subject before someone changes it for him. I'll have something for you by tomorrow morning, he said. And sir, for what it's worth, I've known you 9 years. I've never once seen you wrong about a man's real motive. Not once. There's a first time for everything, Tae-hyun said, though he didn't believe it. Not really. Not with the particular cold clarity that had already settled behind his eyes. He hung up the phone and stood on the balcony a while longer, watching the rain move sideways across the city, thinking about a boy who had spent the last 6 months learning to ride a bicycle badly and lose it go worse, and a woman who had rebuilt her entire life twice out of nothing but stubbornness and indigo dye, and how neither one of them had asked for any of this, and how neither one of them, if it came to it, deserved to lose any of it because an old man was frightened of an audit. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without performing concern the way some people did, just absorbing it, turning it over, asking the questions that actually mattered, instead of the ones that simply filled silence. Can they actually take anything from Kian? She asked. Once Kian was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet, except for the small sound of Mochi's tail thumping occasionally against the floor in his sleep. Legally, I mean. Is there actually something they could do? Tae-hyun considered the question with the same care he gave every serious question she'd ever asked him. The Baekho Group isn't a straightforward inheritance, he said. It's not just money in a will. There's a formal succession process, ratified by the founding council, that determines who's recognized as legitimate leadership. My father built it that way specifically so no outside pressure, no political marriage, no scandal, could force an unqualified successor onto the company. It was meant to protect the family, and now it's being used against the family instead. Now, Tae-hyun said, it's being used by a man who understands the mechanism well enough to weaponize it. I'm not running again, she said finally. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that remembered exactly what running had cost her the last time. I want you to know that right now, before this goes any further, whatever Director Baek is planning, whatever this council decides, I am not packing 2 suitcases and disappearing to protect Kian from a fight that isn't his fault. I did that once. It nearly destroyed both of us. I'm not doing it again. Tae-hyun crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, the way he'd learned over 6 months that she needed sometimes more than she needed words. I would never ask you to, he said. I'm not the man who lets people he loves disappear to keep the peace anymore. I learned that lesson the most expensive way a man can learn anything. Do-yoon called at 6 a.m. the next morning, which told Tae-hyun everything he needed to know about how the night had gone for him before a single word was said. I found something, Do-yoon said. and his voice had the flat, careful quality of a man who had been up all night and did not enjoy what he'd discovered. "You were right to worry. It's worse than we thought. Tell me, Director Baek owns, on paper, 40% of a logistics subsidiary called Cheonbo Freight," Do-yoon said. Cheonbo Freight has been operating 3 of the same shell routes that Dae-sung's forgery specialist was paid through 7 years ago. "Not similar routes, sir. The exact same routes. Different names on the paperwork, same accounts underneath, same pattern of payments, timed suspiciously close to certain, let's call them, delicate operations." Tae-hyun closed his eyes. So he wasn't just aware of what Dae-sung was doing. He was doing the same thing himself, in parallel, for at least as long as Dae-sung was, Do-yoon said. "And here's the part that's going to really ruin your morning, sir. One of the payments out of Cheonbo Freight, dated 4 days after your public accusation against Dae-sung in that boardroom, went to a private investigator. A very specific, very expensive private investigator who specializes in exactly one thing." "What thing?" Tae-hyun said, though some cold, quiet part of him already knew. "Digging up anything that could be used to discredit a person in a custody or legitimacy dispute," Do-yoon said. "Sir, I think Director Baek isn't just worried the audit trail leads back to him eventually. I think he's already decided his best defense is offense. If he can get the council to formally question Kian's legitimacy, question your judgment, maybe even question your fitness to lead given the, and I'm using his language here, quote, instability of your personal life, then any future investigation into his own finances gets buried under a much bigger story. Yours." Tae-hyun stood in his kitchen in the gray early light, his son's soccer ball still sitting in the corner where it had rolled the day before, his wife still asleep down the hall in the life they had spent 6 months carefully, patiently rebuilding, and felt something settle into place inside him, cold and clear and entirely familiar. "Send me everything you have," Tae-hyun said. "Every document, every payment record, every name. Sir, if we move on this too fast, before the council meeting, it could look like retaliation. Bae could spin it as you attacking a respected elder to distract from your own scandal." "I know," Tae-hyun said, "which is exactly why we're not going to move fast. We're going to move carefully. And we're going to let him walk into that meeting thinking he has the upper hand for exactly as long as it takes to make sure everyone in that room understands precisely who he is before he gets the chance to say a single word about my son." There was a pause, and then, in a tone that carried real relief, Do-yoon said, "There it is. I was wondering when the ice would come back." "It never left," Tae-hyun said. "It just learned to sit next to warmer things." That afternoon, Tae-hyun did something he had not done since he was a much younger man, learning his father's business from the ground up. He went to see his mother. Han Mi-suk still lived at the family estate, the same house where Kian had first met his father properly in the garden 6 months earlier, the same house where she had sat across from Naomi in a quiet sitting room and offered her the first real apology of a lifetime spent believing she understood the architecture of her own family. She had changed, in the months since, in ways that surprised almost everyone who knew her, softening at the edges in the specific, careful way that people soften when they've finally been forced to look directly at a mistake they can never fully undo. "You look like your father did," she said, without looking up. "The week before he had to remove one of his oldest friends from the board for stealing from the company. Same face, same walk." Tae-hyun sat down beside her. "Then you already know why I'm here. I received the same letter you did," she said. "I've been on this council longer than you've been alive, Tae-hyun. I know Baek Sung-ho better than most of the men currently sitting on it. He was at your father's wedding. He held you when you were 3 days old. And now he's trying to take everything from my son. Han Mi-suk closed the book finally, setting it down beside her with the same precise, deliberate care she brought to every gesture. Tell me what you found, he told her. All of it. The shell company, the shared routes, the private investigator, the timing. She listened the way she listened to everything, absolutely still, giving nothing away on her face until he finished. And even then, for a long moment, she said nothing at all. Your father trusted 3 men completely in his life, she said finally. His brother, who died before you were old enough to remember him. Choi Dae-sung's father, who died before Dae-sung himself, grew into whatever he became. And Baek Sung-ho. She was quiet a moment longer. I begged your father, once, to diversify his trust more widely. He told me a man who trusts everyone trusts no one properly. I have thought about that conversation more in the last 6 months than in the 20 years before it. Will the council side with him? Tae-hyun asked. Honestly, not what you hope. What you actually believe will happen. Han Mi-suk was quiet for a long time, watching the koi move in slow, unhurried circles beneath the water's surface. 6 months ago, they watched you stand in front of them and tell the truth about your own cousin, knowing it would cost the company its reputation, knowing it would cost you the alliance that was supposed to secure our future, she said. That bought you something with those men. Not loyalty exactly. Respect. But respect fades faster than people like to admit, especially when someone louder and more frightened starts whispering in the same rooms you're no longer standing in every day. You cannot lose this meeting, Tae-hyun. Not because of the company, because of that boy in your garden who finally has a father and a grandmother who is only just learning how to deserve him. Tae-hyun looked at his mother. This woman who had once asked Naomi a single icy question meant as a warning, and had spent 7 years since carrying the weight of everything that question had helped set in motion, and felt something shift between them, quiet and unspoken, the way the most important things between them always seemed to shift. I don't intend to lose anything ever again, he said. Not without a fight that leaves nothing standing afterward for the person who tried to take it. Han Mi-suk almost smiled. That, she said, is the first thing you've said all day that sounds exactly like your father. He did not tell Naomi about his conversation with his mother until later that evening, after Kian had been put to bed with the specific ceremony he now insisted on, a chapter of whatever book he'd chosen that week. A glass of water left exactly on the left side of his nightstand, and mochi curled at the foot of the bed in the spot he had somehow decided, entirely without permission, was his. Naomi was on the balcony when Tae-hyun found her, wrapped in one of his sweaters against the cool evening air, looking out at the same skyline she had been looking at the night he'd told her that whatever came next was worth all of it. She had a habit he'd noticed over the months of coming out here whenever something needed thinking through that couldn't be thought through indoors, the same way she used to disappear into her dye vats whenever a problem needed her hands as much as her mind. You went to see your mother, she said, without turning around. How did you know? You have a specific way of standing when you've been talking to her, Naomi said. Straighter. Like you're still being measured against something. Tae-hyun leaned against the railing beside her, close enough that their arms touched. She thinks the council could actually side with him. Do you think that? I think 6 months ago they believed in me because I stood in front of them and told a hard truth at real cost to myself. Naomi was quiet for a moment, turning that over. What happens if you lose? Formally, the council can vote to designate an alternate line of succession, Tae-hyun said. There's a cousin, distant, on my father's side, who's never shown the slightest interest in the business until approximately 4 days ago, when I'm told he suddenly became very available for dinner with several board members. They move fast. They've had 6 months to prepare for exactly this conversation, Tae-hyun said. I've had 1 day. Naomi turned to face him fully then, the city lights behind her catching the same warmth in her eyes that had first undone him in a tiny dye studio 8 years ago, and something in her expression had shifted from worry into something harder, more resolved. Then we use the day well, she said. What do you need from me? Tae-hyun looked at her for a long moment. In the old world, the world before her, before Kian, before any of this, the answer to that question would have been simple. Nothing. Stay out of it. Let me handle the parts of my life that could hurt you. He had learned, at enormous cost, that this instinct, however well-intentioned, was the exact instinct that had once cost him 7 years of his son's life. I need you to understand something first, he said. Whatever Baek is planning to bring into that room, it isn't going to stay confined to boardroom politics. A man desperate enough to weaponize a family council against a child is a man desperate enough to look for every possible angle. That includes you, your past, your history, anything that could be twisted to make you look like exactly what Yoon did to you 7 years ago. A threat instead of a person. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Let him look. I mean it, Naomi. If there's anything at all in your history that a very well-paid, very thorough private investigator could dig up and present in a way designed to hurt you, I need to know about it now. From you, before I hear about it from Do-yoon's files. Or worse, before I hear about it in that meeting. She was quiet for a long moment, and Tae-hyun watched something move across her face that he recognized instantly, because it was the exact expression she'd worn the night, 7 years ago, standing in a doorway telling him about photographs and threats and a country 8,000 miles from her mother. It was the look of a woman deciding how much of an old wound to reopen out loud. There's nothing illegal, she said finally. Nothing criminal. But there's something I've never told you, because it never seemed relevant, and honestly, because it still embarrasses me a little even now. Tell me, when I first got to Atlanta, 7 years ago, pregnant, terrified, with almost no money left after the flight and the deposit on a tiny apartment, I took a job for about 6 weeks doing administrative work for a man who turned out to be running an immigration fraud scheme out of a storefront that claimed to help people file visa paperwork, Naomi said. I didn't know what it was when I took the job. I found out when the police raided the office on my 7th week there. I wasn't charged with anything. I cooperated fully with the investigation, gave a statement, testified against him eventually when it went to trial. But my name is in that file. Tae-hyun, connected, even briefly, even innocently, to a fraud case. If someone wanted to build a story about an unstable woman with a shady history who showed up out of nowhere claiming your son, that's exactly the kind of thread they'd pull. Tae-hyun felt something cold settle in his stomach, not because he believed for 1 second that Naomi had done anything wrong, but because he understood, immediately and completely, exactly how a man like Baek would use it. Did the case ever connect your name to anything public, press coverage, court records that are searchable? The trial made local news for about 2 days, Naomi said. My name was in one article, spelled wrong, no photograph. I testified under a different legal spelling because of a clerical error on the original paperwork that I never bothered to fix because I never imagined it would matter to anyone again. It's findable, Tae-hyun said quietly. If someone's already paying a specialist to build a case against you, they'll find it eventually, misspelling or not. Then let's find it first, Naomi said. Let's make sure whoever's in that room already knows the whole truth before Baek gets the chance to tell half of it. Tae-hyun and BC ended up working together over the following 3 days in a way that surprised absolutely everyone, including themselves. BC had shown up at the penthouse the morning after Naomi told Tae-hyun about the Atlanta case, arriving with the specific brisk energy of a woman who had already decided, without being asked, that she was involved now and there was no version of events where she wasn't. "I've known Naomi longer than either of you men have been useful to her," BC announced, setting her bag down on the kitchen counter with the finality of someone establishing territory. "If there's ancient history that needs digging up before some corrupt old man tries to weaponize it, I'm the one who actually remembers the details correctly. Naomi minimizes things when she's scared. I've watched her do it for 7 years. I don't minimize things," Naomi said, from where she was making coffee. "You just told him it was a 6-week job, and it embarrassed you a little," BC said. "You cried for 2 days after that raid because you thought immigration was going to deport you while pregnant and alone in a country you just fled to. That's not a little embarrassing, Naomi. That's traumatic. Tell the story properly, or I will." Naomi set down the coffee pot and looked at her oldest friend for a long moment, something complicated moving across her face. "Fine," she said finally. "Tell it properly then." What emerged over the next several hours, as BC and Tae-hyun worked through old memories and old paperwork side by side at the kitchen table, occasionally bickering about methodology in a way that made Kian, watching cartoons on the couch nearby, ask his mother in a stage whisper whether Uncle Tae-hyun and Auntie BC were going to get married, was a far more complete and far more sympathetic version of events than the bare facts Naomi had given Tae-hyun the night before. She had arrived in Atlanta 7 years ago with barely $3,000 to her name, pregnant, alone, having fled a country and a man she believed had already chosen someone else, while letting her be hunted in shadows she never fully understood. She had taken the administrative job at what she believed was a legitimate immigration assistance office because it was the first job she was offered that didn't ask too many questions about her sudden return from Seoul or her visible pregnancy, and because she needed money for rent within 2 weeks, or she and the child she was carrying would have nowhere to sleep. She had not known, could not have known, that the man running the office was systematically defrauding vulnerable immigrants by charging them for visa applications he never actually filed. She had discovered it the same day everyone else discovered it, standing in the office when federal agents came through the door, and rather than run, rather than protect herself the way a frightened, exhausted, pregnant 26-year-old might reasonably have chosen to do, she had stayed and told the truth. All of it. She had handed over 3 weeks of her own careful notes, records she'd kept out of simple administrative instinct that ended up forming a significant part of the case against the man who ran the scheme. She testified for 6 hours, BC said, reading from an old email she'd dug up, sent to her by Naomi during the trial itself, 7 years ago. 6 hours, 7 months pregnant, in a courthouse, against a man with actual organized crime connections, who had people showing up outside her apartment for weeks afterward, trying to intimidate her into recanting. She never recanted, not once. The prosecutor thanked her personally in his closing statement. "This isn't a skeleton in her closet, Tae-hyun. This is the single bravest thing either of us has ever watched anyone do, and if anyone tries to twist it into something ugly in that meeting, I will personally fly to Seoul just to watch you destroy them for it." Tae-hyun, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway listening for the last several minutes, felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a fresh, sharp understanding of exactly who he had married. "You never told me any of that," he said quietly, looking at Naomi. "You never asked what those 6 weeks actually cost me," Naomi said. "You asked if there was anything embarrassing. I told you the embarrassing part. I didn't tell you the part where I sat in a courtroom 7 months pregnant testifying against organized criminals because I couldn't stand the idea of walking away from the truth twice in one lifetime." Do-yoon, who had gone very quiet during BC's reading of the old email, cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, ma'am," he said, "I've worked for this family 9 years. I've watched a lot of powerful people do a lot of things under pressure. What you just described is not something most people do, pregnant or not, terrified or not. That's not a weakness Baek can use against you. That's a weapon he doesn't know he handed us." Naomi looked at him, surprised. "You think we should bring it up ourselves, proactively, before he does?" "I think," Do-yoon said slowly, "that a man like Baek is counting on the shock value of a scandal he assumes will make you look unstable or hidden. If you walk into that room and tell that story first, in your own words, with the actual documentation to back it up, you don't just neutralize his attack. You turn it into evidence of exactly the kind of character this family should be proud to have married into." Tae-hyun looked between his wife, her oldest friend, and the man who had driven him through 9 years and 2 entirely different versions of his own life, and felt, for the first time since the letter arrived, something that resembled actual confidence instead of grim determination. "We're not just going to survive this meeting," he said. "We're going to walk in and make Baek regret ever thinking a family this strong was an easy target." That evening, after BC had finally gone home and Do-yoon had left with a stack of documents to have properly authenticated and organized for presentation, Tae-hyun found himself sitting on the edge of Kian's bed, while his son, exhausted from a full day of what he had cheerfully described as helping Mom and Uncle Do-yoon with grown-up stuff, despite having spent most of it watching cartoons, fought valiantly and unsuccessfully against sleep. "Are people trying to take stuff away from us?" Kian asked, with the sudden, disarming directness that Tae-hyun still hadn't fully adjusted to. 7 years of missed childhood not having prepared him at all for the particular experience of being asked devastating questions by a 7-year-old holding a stuffed elephant. Tae-hyun considered lying, briefly, the way he might once have considered it necessary for a child's protection. He had learned, slowly, over 6 months, that Kian's questions deserved honest answers scaled to what he could actually understand, not comforting fictions that would eventually crumble and cost more trust than they'd ever bought. "Some people are trying to make trouble for our family," he said carefully. "Nothing that's going to hurt you directly, but I want you to know that if you hear grown-ups talking about it, or if you notice your mom and me being more serious than usual for a few days, that's why. It's not because of anything you did." Kian considered this with the gravity he brought to everything, including tomato plants and unfamiliar dogs, and increasingly, the emotional undercurrents of adult conversations he was clearly absorbing more of than either parent fully realized. "Is it because of me?" he asked. "Because I'm half. Some kids at school say things sometimes. Not mean exactly, just questions. Like, why do I look different from the other kids in my class photo?" Something in Tae-hyun's chest tightened painfully. The specific ache of realizing his son had been carrying a quiet weight he'd never once mentioned. "What do you tell them?" Tae-hyun asked, keeping his voice level, though it cost him some effort. "I tell them my mom is from America and my dad is from here, and that makes me from both places, which is better than just being from one place," Kian said, with the simple, unshakable confidence of a child who had clearly worked this answer out for himself and found it satisfactory. Is that not the right answer? That's exactly the right answer, Tae-hyun said, his voice rougher than he intended. That's a better answer than most adults would give. So is it because of me? The trouble? Tae-hyun hesitated, then decided, the way he'd learned to decide most things with his son, that the truth, carefully framed, was always the better choice than a comfortable evasion. Some people in my family's business think that because your mom is American and because you and I only found each other recently, instead of you growing up here your whole life, that maybe I'm not supposed to be able to pass certain things down to you, the way I would if things had happened differently. Tae-hyun said, I think that's a foolish, small way of thinking about family. I think you are exactly, completely mine, in every way that matters, and I intend to make sure everyone who matters understands that, whether they like it or not. Kian was quiet for a moment, processing this with the same serious, unhurried attention he'd given everything since the day Tae-hyun met him. Are you scared? He asked finally. The question landed harder than Tae-hyun expected. He had spent his entire adult life being the person other people feared, the man whose silence alone made grown executives forget how to speak, and here was his own son, small and sleepy and utterly without artifice, asking him the one question no one in his professional life would ever have dared to ask. A little, Tae-hyun admitted, because he had promised himself, somewhere in these 6 months, that he would never lie to this boy about the things that actually mattered. Not scared that I'll stop loving you, or that your mom and I will stop being your parents. Scared that people who are supposed to understand what family means might try to make things harder for us than they need to be. But being a little scared doesn't mean I'm going to let it change anything. I learned that from your mom, actually. She taught me that. Kian yawned, his eyes finally beginning to lose their fight against sleep. She's brave, he said. She told me once that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you are. That sounds exactly like something she'd say. Dad? It was still new enough. That word, delivered so casually now after months of careful adjustment, that it caught in Tae-hyun's chest every single time. Yeah, buddy? Whatever the trouble is, are we gonna be okay? Tae-hyun reached out and gently smoothed his son's hair back from his forehead, the same unhurried, deliberate gesture he had once used on Naomi's bracelet, on things he had decided mattered enough to be careful with. Yes, he said, and meant it with a certainty he hadn't quite possessed 24 hours earlier, before an old email and an afternoon at the kitchen table had reminded him exactly what kind of people he had around him. We are absolutely going to be okay, I promise you that. Kian was asleep within minutes, one hand still loosely curled around his stuffed elephant, and Tae-hyun sat there a while longer in the dim light of his son's room, thinking about fear and family and the particular kind of courage it took to walk toward a fight instead of away from one, before finally rising and going to find his wife. He found her in the kitchen, going through the old email records with Do-yoon's careful annotations added in the margins, her reading glasses, a new habit she'd picked up over the past year that she pretended to be annoyed about, pushed up into her braids. He asked me if we were going to be okay, Tae-hyun said, settling into the chair across from her. Naomi looked up. What did you tell him? That yes. Absolutely. I promised him. Good, she said. Because we are. I believe that more than I did this morning, Tae-hyun admitted. Watching you BC, Do-yoon, all of it today. I think I forgot, somewhere along the way, that I'm not fighting this alone anymore. I spent so many years being the only person who ever handled anything difficult in my own life that some part of me still expects to be standing in that boardroom by myself in 6 days. You're not, Naomi said simply. You haven't been alone since the day you dropped that ring on a sidewalk in Gangnam, whether you fully believed it yet or not. I'm starting to believe it now. Good, Naomi said again, and reached across the table to take his hand, the same unhurried, deliberate gesture he'd used on his sleeping son not 10 minutes earlier. The same quiet promise passed between them, without either of them needing to name it out loud. Because director Baek Sung-ho has absolutely no idea what he actually just started. Enjoying the story so far? Then you'll love my ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection, featuring 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you can't get on YouTube, which you can enjoy anytime. Just click the link below or scan the QR code by pausing the video, opening your phone's camera, and pointing it at your TV or screen. Your next favorite romance could be waiting for you before this story even ends. 6 days felt like both an eternity and no time at all. The way any deadline attached to something that actually matters tends to stretch and compress in equal measure, depending on which hour of the night you happen to be lying awake in. Tae-hyun spent those 6 days doing something he had never once done in the entirety of his professional life, which was preparing for a confrontation not by calculating the coldest, most efficient path to victory, but by making sure every single person who might be hurt by what was coming understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what role, if any, they wanted to play in it. Han Mi-suk made 3 calls a day to old contacts on the council. Careful, measured conversations that revealed nothing directly, but reminded certain men, gently and precisely, of decades of loyalty her late husband had once extended to them personally. Do-yoon and BC finished authenticating every document related to Naomi's testimony from 7 years earlier, working with a lawyer Tae-hyun trusted completely, a quiet, meticulous woman named Attorney Song, who had handled the Baekho Group's most sensitive legal matters for over a decade, and had never once, in that time, been wrong about how a room full of powerful men would react to a piece of evidence. And Tae-hyun himself spent those 6 days doing the thing that frightened him more than any boardroom confrontation ever could. He spent them being as consistently and deliberately as he knew how, simply present, at soccer practice, at bedtime, at the kitchen counter arguing with Kian about whether cereal counted as an acceptable dinner, because some stubborn, newly discovered part of him understood that whatever happened in that meeting, his son needed to remember these 6 days as ordinary, not as the week everything nearly fell apart. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, in the same 40th floor boardroom where Tae-hyun had once stood in front of every senior leader his father had ever trusted and confessed the truth about his cousin's decade of betrayal. The room looked exactly the same as it had 6 months earlier. The same long mahogany table, the same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had no particular interest in the private wars being waged 40 floors above its streets. But the energy in the room was entirely different, and Tae-hyun felt it the moment he stepped through the door. 6 months ago, he had walked into that room as a man in the middle of an earthquake, grief and fury and revelation all still raw and visible on his face. Today he walked in composed, deliberate, flanked by Attorney Song on one side, carrying a single slim folder, and by Naomi on the other, who had insisted, over his initial hesitation, on attending in person rather than waiting at home for news. "I'm not hiding in another room while people decide whether my son is legitimate enough to exist in this family," she had told him that morning, fastening a simple gold earring, a gift from him on their 6th-month anniversary, into place with steady hands. "If Director Baek wants to question my character, he can do it while I'm sitting directly across the table from him, watching his face. Director Baek Sung-ho was already seated at the far end of the table when they entered, exactly where he had sat 6 months earlier during Tae-hyun's original confession. A heavy-set man in his early 70s, with silver hair combed precisely back, and the kind of unhurried, patient bearing that decades of quiet power tends to produce. He rose slightly as they entered, a gesture of formal courtesy that fooled no one in the room. "Chairman Lee," he said, inclining his head. "Mrs. Lee, thank you for accommodating this meeting on such short notice." "You gave us 7 days, Director Baek," Tae-hyun said, taking his seat at the head of the table, the position his father had occupied for 30 years before him. "I wouldn't call that short notice. I'd call it exactly enough time." Something flickered behind Baek's calm expression, gone almost before Tae-hyun could confirm he'd seen it at all. The other 6 members of the founding council filed in over the next several minutes. Older men mostly, several of whom Tae-hyun had known his entire life. Men who had attended his father's funeral, who had watched him grow from a serious child into a serious young man into, eventually, the reluctant heir to an empire he'd never fully wanted. He read their faces as they settled into their seats, the way he'd been trained his entire life to read a room before it revealed itself in words, and what he saw was not hostility, not yet, but a kind of careful, waiting neutrality. The specific expression of men who had not yet decided which way this particular wind was blowing, and had every intention of waiting to see before committing themselves. Director Baek waited until everyone was seated, then folded his hands on the table in front of him with the deliberate patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times. "I want to begin," he said, "by saying that nothing in what follows should be understood as a personal attack on Chairman Lee or on his family. My concern, as it has always been throughout my 30 years on this council, is the long-term stability and integrity of the Baekho Group. 6 months ago, this council watched a painful scandal unfold, one that revealed serious corruption within our own ranks. We handled it, I believe, with integrity. We removed Choi Dae-sung from his position. We cooperated with the resulting investigation, and we affirmed Chairman Lee's leadership going forward." "You're building to something, Director Baek," Tae-hyun said evenly. "I'd appreciate you getting to it." A thin smile crossed Baek's face. There and gone. Since that scandal, several members of this council, myself included, have grown increasingly concerned about the manner in which the succession of this company's leadership has been handled. Specifically, the recognition of a child, born outside of marriage, to a foreign woman with a, shall we say, complicated personal history, as heir apparent to an organization this council's founders spent decades building with great care and considerable personal sacrifice. "Say what you mean, Director," Han Mi-suk said sharply, from where she sat, uninvited but entirely unwilling to be excluded, near the far end of the table. "You've known that boy since the day his father acknowledged him publicly. You sent a gift to his 7th birthday. Say what has actually changed in your assessment since then, because it certainly isn't your affection for the child." Baek's composure held, but something tightened almost imperceptibly around his eyes. "What has changed, Madam Han, is that my responsibility to this council obligates me to raise uncomfortable questions when they arise, regardless of personal feelings. And an uncomfortable question has arisen." He nodded toward a folder in front of him and slid it down the table toward Tae-hyun with the unhurried confidence of a man playing a card he believed unbeatable. "This is a summary compiled by an independent investigator, engaged at my own personal expense, out of concern for this company's stability. It concerns Mrs. Lee's activities during her time in Atlanta, prior to her return to Seoul." The room went very still. Tae-hyun did not open the folder. He simply looked at Baek, his expression giving away nothing. "Go on," he said. Baek's smile widened slightly, mistaking the stillness for uncertainty, rather than the deliberate patience it actually was. 7 years ago, upon fleeing Seoul while pregnant, Mrs. Lee took employment at an office in Atlanta that was subsequently raided by federal authorities and found to be operating an immigration fraud scheme. Her name appears in the resulting court records, connected, however tangentially, to a criminal enterprise. I raise this not to cast aspersions on Mrs. Lee's current character, which I have no doubt has developed considerably in the years since, but to raise a legitimate question about the judgment this council is being asked to trust when it comes to designating a line of succession. If the mother of our future heir has a documented history of proximity to criminal activity, however innocent her involvement may have been, does this council not have an obligation to at least discuss the implications? He sat back, visibly pleased with himself, glancing around the table to gauge the reaction of his fellow council members, several of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. Naomi did not wait for Tae-hyun to respond. She had agreed, days earlier, exactly how this moment would unfold if Baek chose to raise it, and she rose from her seat now with the same steady, deliberate calm she had once used to stand her ground against Chairman Woo at a gala 6 months into her marriage, or against a man who broke into her workshop with a bamboo dye rod as her only weapon. "Director Baek," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the long table. "May I address the council directly?" Baek's smile faltered, just slightly, clearly not having anticipated that the subject of his careful revelation would simply stand up and speak for herself, rather than allow her husband to defend her. "Of course, Mrs. Lee," he said, recovering. "This concerns you directly, after all. 7 years ago," Naomi began, and her voice did not shake, though the weight of what she was about to say sat heavy in her chest. "I arrived in Atlanta with $3,000, 7 months pregnant, having just discovered that the man I loved was, as far as I knew at the time, already committed to marrying someone else. I had no family support waiting for me. My own mother did not learn I was pregnant until months later, because I was too ashamed and too frightened to tell her the full truth of what had happened. I needed work within 2 weeks, or I would have nowhere to live and no way to prepare for the child I was carrying." She paused, looking directly at Director Baek, then let her gaze move deliberately around the table, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. "I took the only job I was offered that week, administrative work at what I believed, and had every reasonable expectation to believe, was a legitimate visa assistance office. I did not know, could not have known, that the man running that office was defrauding vulnerable immigrants. I discovered the truth the same day federal investigators did, standing in that office when they came through the door. I was not charged with any crime, Director Baek, because I had committed no crime. What I did instead, 7 months pregnant and utterly terrified, was volunteer my own careful administrative records to the investigators. Records that formed a significant part of the case that eventually convicted that man of fraud against dozens of families far more vulnerable than I was." She reached into the folder Attorney Song had prepared, pulling out a single document, and slid it down the table to sit directly beside the folder Director Baek had presented. "This is the trial transcript from that case," she said. "I testified for 6 hours, 7 months pregnant, in a courtroom, against a man with genuine organized crime connections, knowing full well that people connected to him were already showing up outside my apartment, attempting to intimidate me into silence. I did not recant. I did not run. The prosecuting attorney personally thanked me in his closing statement for what he called, and I am quoting directly, Extraordinary civic courage, under circumstances that would have broken most people twice my age. The room was completely silent now. Tae-hyun watched several of the older council members lean forward slightly, reading the document Naomi had placed on the table, their expressions shifting in ways that had nothing to do with the careful neutrality they'd arrived with. Director Baek is correct that my name appears in a court record connected to a criminal enterprise, Naomi continued, her voice steady, almost gentle now, the particular gentleness of someone who has decided that anger, however justified, would serve her less well than clarity. What he did not mention, and what I suspect his very expensive private investigator either failed to find or chose not to include, is that I appear in that record as a witness for the prosecution, not as a defendant. I appear in that record because I chose, at considerable personal risk while pregnant and alone in a foreign country, to tell the truth rather than protect myself by staying silent. She looked directly at Baek now, and something hardened in her expression. I would ask this council to consider, honestly, whether that history reflects poorly on my judgment, or whether it demonstrates exactly the kind of character this family should be proud to have, raising its future heir. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the older council members, a thin, quiet man named Director Cho, who had said almost nothing since the meeting began, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Lee," he said, "may I ask why this history was never previously disclosed to the council?" "Because no one asked," Naomi said simply. "And because, until 7 days ago, I did not realize my personal history from 7 years ago was considered relevant to my son's legitimacy within this family. I would have shared it gladly. At any point, had anyone thought to inquire rather than pay someone to investigate." Director Cho nodded slowly, then turned to look at Director Baek with an expression that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from neutrality into something considerably more skeptical. "Director Baek," he said, "you mentioned engaging this investigator at your own personal expense, out of concern for the company's stability. May I ask what prompted that specific concern, 6 months after this council already voted to affirm Chairman Lee's household and his son's position?" It was a small question, carefully phrased, but Tae-hyun watched something flicker across Baek's face, the first genuine crack in his composure since the meeting began. "As I said, Director Cho," Baek said, his voice slightly less steady than it had been minutes earlier, "my responsibility to this council obligates me to raise questions as they arise." "Yes, you said that," Director Cho said. "I'm asking what specifically arose, 6 months after the fact, to prompt this particular expenditure of your personal resources into investigating the chairman's wife." Tae-hyun watched Director Baek's carefully constructed composure hold for another moment, and then, with the quiet, deliberate precision of a man who had been waiting 6 days for exactly this opening, he spoke. "Perhaps I can help answer that question," Tae-hyun said. "Director Cho, gentlemen, before we continue discussing my wife's history, I think it's worth taking a moment to discuss Director Baek's." Every head at the table turned toward him. Baek's face went very still. "6 months ago," Tae-hyun continued, his voice carrying the same even, unhurried calm he had used the day he stood in this exact room and confessed the truth about his cousin. "This council learned that Choi Dae-sung had spent nearly a decade running fraudulent shell companies through this organization's logistics division, routing payments to forgers, fixers, and hired men through accounts with 3 layers of concealed ownership. That investigation was, at the time, presented as complete. Dae-sung was removed. The matter was considered closed." "What does this have to do with the present discussion?" Baek said, his voice tighter now than it had been at any point in the meeting. "I'm getting to that, Director Baek," Tae-hyun said, because in the 6 months since that investigation supposedly closed, my team has continued reviewing the financial architecture Dae-sung built, out of simple due diligence, to ensure nothing was missed. And what we found was that the shell routes Dae-sung used were not, as this counsel was led to believe, exclusively his own creation. He nodded to Attorney Song, who opened her slim folder and began distributing copies of a document to each council member in turn. What we found, gentlemen, is that a logistics subsidiary called Cheonbo Freight, in which Director Baek Sung-ho personally holds a 40% ownership stake, has been operating 3 of the identical shell routes Dae-sung used for a comparable length of time, with payment patterns that align suspiciously closely with several of the same delicate operations. The room erupted into low, urgent murmuring. Director Baek's face had gone pale, the careful composure he had maintained for the entire meeting finally, completely collapsing. "This is a fabrication," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "A desperate smear, timed precisely to distract from legitimate concerns about—" "It is not a fabrication, Director Baek," Attorney Song said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, her voice calm and clinical in a way that somehow made the accusation land with even greater weight. "These are authenticated banking records, cross-referenced against the original forensic audit conducted after Choi Dae-sung's arrest. I would also direct the Council's attention to page 4, which documents a payment from Cheonbo Freight to a private investigation firm, dated exactly 4 days after Chairman Lee publicly accused his cousin of orchestrating the events that separated him from his family 7 years ago." Director Baek's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Tae-hyun had known him, he looked, unmistakably, like a man who understood he had just watched the ground disappear beneath his own feet. Naomi remained standing, watching this unfold with the same steady composure she had brought to the entire meeting, and Tae-hyun caught her eye across the room, a small, unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, the particular understanding of 2 people who had walked into a fight together and were now watching it turn, decisively, in their favor. "I would suggest," Tae-hyun said, into the stunned silence that had settled over the boardroom, that Director Baek's sudden concern for this family's legitimacy, arriving precisely 6 months after this council closed an investigation that, it now appears, never should have been considered complete, deserves considerably more scrutiny than my wife's 7-year-old testimony against a fraud she herself helped bring to justice." Director Baek rose from his chair, his face flushed with a mixture of fury and fear that he could no longer contain. "You cannot simply—" "Sit down, Director Baek," said an elderly voice from the far end of the table. It belonged to the oldest man in the room, a founding council member named Director Im, who had said nothing at all since the meeting began. A contemporary of Tae-hyun's own father, who had known him since he was born. "I have sat on this council for 32 years. I watched this family survive one betrayal from within 6 months ago. I will not sit here and watch a second one unfold in real time without asking the necessary questions." He turned his gaze to Baek with an expression of profound, weary disappointment. "Sit down and answer the chairman's evidence honestly, or leave this room and let the rest of us determine what happens next without you." For a long moment, Director Baek Sung-ho stood frozen at the far end of the table, the same table where he had once helped build an empire, alongside a man who had trusted him completely, staring at the evidence spread before him, at the woman he had tried to discredit, standing calm and unbroken across the room, at the man he had underestimated, watching him with the exact quiet, patient stillness that had once made grown executives forget their own names. And in that silence, heavy and absolute, Everyone in the room understood that whatever happened next was going to determine far more than simply the fate of one man's directorship. Director Baek Sung-ho did not sit down. Instead, he did something that surprised almost everyone at the table, including, for one brief unguarded moment, Tae-hyun himself. He straightened his jacket, gathered the folder in front of him with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and looked around the room at men he had called colleagues, friends, in some cases something closer to family, for 30 years. "I built half of what sits beneath this table," Baek said, his voice low now, stripped of its earlier confident polish. "I was there before Tae-hyun was born. I was there when his father had nothing but ambition and a dead man's shipping license. You would take the word of a foreign woman with $3,000 in her pocket and a boy's forged evidence over 3 decades of loyalty. No one has taken anyone's word over anything, Director Baek," Han Mi-suk said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension in the room. "We have taken evidence. Authenticated banking records. The same standard this council applied to Choi Dae-sung 6 months ago, when you yourself were the loudest voice calling for his immediate removal, if I recall correctly." Something in Baek's expression cracked at that, the last thin veneer of his composure finally giving way entirely. "Dae-sung was careless," he said, and the words came out bitter, almost involuntary. The sound of a man who had held something contained for so long that its release now felt like relief, even as it destroyed him. "I was careful. For 10 years I was careful. I never once let the roots overlap in a way that could be traced back cleanly. I never once." He stopped himself. Too late, the room having already heard exactly what needed to be heard. Director Im closed his eyes briefly, an old man absorbing a betrayal he had clearly hoped, right up until that exact sentence, would somehow prove to be a misunderstanding. "You've just confirmed it yourself, Sung-ho," he said quietly, using the old man's given name for what Tae-hyun suspected was the last time anyone at that table ever would. "In front of 6 witnesses and a recording device that has been running since this meeting began, as is standard council procedure, which you yourself insisted upon 30 years ago, if memory serves." Baek's face went the color of ash. He looked, for the first time, genuinely old, the confident weight of decades of quiet power draining out of him in real time, as he understood exactly what he had just done to himself in a single, unguarded sentence. Attorney Song did not gloat. She simply closed her folder with the same clinical calm she had maintained throughout the meeting, and said, "The recording will be provided to the appropriate authorities alongside the rest of the forensic documentation. I would recommend Director Baek retain counsel before he leaves this building." The vote that followed took less than 20 minutes, though it felt, to everyone in that room, considerably longer. Director Baek was escorted from the building by 2 members of internal security before the council even finished its formal deliberation. His 40 years of quiet influence collapsing into nothing in the space of a single stunned morning. The remaining council members, chastened and visibly shaken by how close they had come to being manipulated a second time by a man they had trusted implicitly, voted unanimously, without discussion, to formally and permanently affirm Kian's legitimate standing as heir to the Baekho Group's leadership structure, and to commend, in language that Attorney Song later admitted was unusually warm for a formal council record, Naomi's conduct both 7 years earlier and in the meeting that had just concluded. Director Im was the one who approached Naomi afterward as the room slowly emptied and the tension finally began to loosen from everyone's shoulders. He was a small, stooped man, older than anyone else at the table, with the particular gentleness that some men only seem to develop very late in life, after decades of hardness, have finally worn down into something softer underneath. "Mrs. Lee," he said, taking her hand in both of his, an old-fashioned gesture that seemed to genuinely move Naomi, despite everything she had just endured. "I knew your father-in-law for 40 years. I stood beside him at his own wedding. I want you to know that what you did in this room today, the way you stood and told a hard truth about yourself, before anyone could twist it into a lie, that is exactly the kind of courage he would have respected more than anything else this family has built. I am ashamed it took this long for this council to see it clearly." Naomi, who had walked into that boardroom prepared for battle and had somehow, in the space of one long morning, ended up being thanked by an elderly stranger for bravery she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying alone for 7 years, found that she could not immediately find words to answer him. "Thank you," she managed finally. "That means more than you probably realize." "I suspect it means exactly as much as I realize," Director Im said, with a small, knowing smile. And then he shuffled off toward the elevator, leaving Naomi standing beside her husband in a boardroom that had, over the course of one morning, gone from the site of the greatest threat their family had faced since Dae Sung's arrest to the place where that threat had been decisively, permanently dismantled. Tae-hyun took her hand as they walked out, past the long mahogany table where his father had once sat for 30 years, past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had no idea how close, once again, everything had come to falling apart, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized now, having felt it several times over the past 6 months, as the particular relief of having fought for something and won, together, rather than alone. "You were extraordinary in there," he said, once they were in the elevator, the doors closing on the 40th floor and the wreckage of Director Baek's career. "You had already found the evidence," Naomi said. "I just told the truth." "You did more than that," Tae-hyun said. "You took the exact thing he tried to use as a weapon against you and turned it into the reason every man in that room ended up respecting you more than they did an hour earlier. I've spent my entire life learning strategy from men who spent decades studying it. I don't think I've ever seen anyone execute it better than you did just now. And you didn't even think of it as strategy." Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder as the elevator descended, the adrenaline of the morning finally beginning to ebb out of her. "I didn't have a strategy," she admitted. "I just refused to let a room full of powerful men decide, one more time in my life, what my own history meant, without me being the one to say it first. That's the only strategy that ever actually works," Tae-hyun said quietly. "I learned that from you. It took me 34 years and losing you once to learn it. But I got there eventually." Do-yoon was waiting for them in the lobby, pacing in the specific way he only paced when genuinely anxious. And the moment he saw their faces, something in his own posture visibly relaxed. "Well?" he said, though the answer was already written plainly across both their expressions. "Baek is finished," Tae-hyun said. "Council voted unanimously to affirm Kian's standing. Attorney Song is already coordinating with the authorities on the financial records." Do-yoon closed his eyes briefly, exhaling something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer of thanks to whatever deities he privately believed handled matters of this magnitude. "I have never once in 9 years doubted you, sir. But I will admit, I spent most of this morning doing exactly that, in a parking garage, alone, with entirely too much coffee." "You doubted correctly for about the first 30 minutes, Tae-hyun admitted. "It could have gone very differently if Naomi hadn't stood up and taken control of the room before I even had the chance to present our evidence." "I would say I'm not surprised," Do-yoon said, looking at Naomi with genuine, unguarded admiration. "Except that would be a lie. Because every single time I think I've finally understood exactly how formidable this family is, one of you finds a way to prove me wrong again. They picked Kian up from school that afternoon, both of them together, which had become something of a tradition over the past 6 months, on days when Tae-hyun's schedule allowed it. And Kian, who had no idea what had transpired that morning, beyond the vague understanding that some grown-up trouble had needed handling, ran toward them across the schoolyard with the specific, unguarded joy of a child whose entire world remained, blessedly, exactly as stable and safe as it had been the day before. "Did you win?" he asked, breathless, throwing his backpack into the car with more enthusiasm than care. "We won," Naomi confirmed, buckling him into his seat. "Was it because of the tomatoes?" Tae-hyun, adjusting the rearview mirror, felt a laugh escape him before he could stop it, the first genuinely unguarded laugh of the entire day. "What tomatoes, buddy? You said grown-ups sometimes make things complicated when they don't need to be," Kian said, with the earnest logic of a 7-year-old who had clearly been turning the family's earlier conversation over in his mind all day. "Tomatoes are simple. You plant them, you water them, they grow. I figured maybe the trouble got fixed because someone finally started acting simple instead of complicated." Naomi and Tae-hyun exchanged a glance in the rearview mirror, the specific kind of glance shared only by parents who have just been handed, entirely by accident, a piece of wisdom more profound than either of them had managed to articulate all day. "You know," Naomi said, turning around to look at her son properly, "I think that's exactly what happened." That evening, after Kian had been fed, bathed, and put through his increasingly elaborate bedtime negotiation process, which had somehow expanded over the past 6 months, from a single chapter of a book to a chapter, a song, a specific arrangement of stuffed animals, and a promise that Mochi would be allowed to sleep at the foot of the bed rather than in his own designated corner, Tae-hyun found himself once again on the balcony, though this time Naomi joined him almost immediately, carrying 2 cups of the bitter Nigerian coffee her aunt still shipped her from Lagos every few months. The same coffee she had once started saving for him in secret, years before either of them understood what they were building. "I want to tell you something," Tae-hyun said, taking the cup from her hands, "that I haven't told anyone, not even my mother, not in all these years." Naomi looked at him carefully, recognizing, from long practice now, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was about to say something that had cost him considerable effort to decide to share. "When my father died," Tae-hyun said, looking out at the city rather than at her, the way he still sometimes did when the things he was saying touched something old and unhealed, "I was 26 years old, younger than you were when I met you. And in the weeks after his funeral, when I was suddenly responsible for everything he'd built, every shipping route, every shell company, every quiet arrangement that kept the whole structure standing, I remember thinking, very clearly, that the only way I was going to survive this was to become exactly as unreachable as he had been. I decided, consciously, deliberately, that I would never again let anyone close enough to threaten what I was building, because I had watched what losing control of even one relationship could cost a man in this world. I thought that was strength. And then I walked into your life and argued with you about a bolt of fabric," Naomi said quietly. "And then you walked into my life," Tae-hyun agreed. "And every single plan I had made about how to survive this world fell apart within 4 months, and I let it fall apart, because some part of me, even then, understood that the version of strength my father had taught me was actually just a very sophisticated kind of loneliness." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "What I want you to understand," he continued, "is that today, In that boardroom, watching you stand up and refuse to let anyone else control your own story, I understood something I don't think I fully understood even 6 months ago, when I stood in that exact room and told the truth about Dae-sung. I understood that the reason I nearly lost everything 7 years ago wasn't because I loved you too openly. It was because I loved you in secret, carefully, in a way that left room for someone like Dae-sung to convince you I'd already chosen someone else. If I had brought you into my world honestly from the beginning, the way you brought me into that boardroom today, standing beside me instead of waiting somewhere safer, none of what happened to us would have been possible. Naomi set her cup down on the railing and turned to face him fully. You're saying you've learned something from watching me do what I've always done. I'm saying, Tae-hyun said, that I spent 34 years believing that protecting the people I loved meant keeping them separate from the parts of my life that could hurt them. And what I've learned from you, from Kian, from watching you stand up today and turn Baek's own weapon back on him with nothing but the truth, is that the people I love don't actually need to be protected from my life. They need to be trusted with it, fully, even the parts that frighten me to share. Naomi reached up and touched his face gently. The same careful, deliberate gesture he had used on her wrist, on a bandage he hadn't asked to give her, on every small thing over the years that he had decided mattered enough to handle with care. That, she said softly, is the bravest thing I've ever heard you say. And I've watched you stand in front of an entire boardroom and confess your own cousin's betrayal in front of every senior leader your father ever trusted. That confession cost me a company scandal, Tae-hyun said. This one cost me admitting, out loud, that I've spent most of my adult life confusing control with love. They're not the same thing, Naomi said. No, Tae-hyun agreed. They're not. I know that now. I think, honestly, some part of me has known it since the moment I dropped that ring on the sidewalk and forgot, for the first time in my adult life, to calculate anything at all. They stood there together for a long while, the city stretching out gray and quiet beneath them. The same city that had once tried, through the careful cruelty of one desperate man and then another, to keep this family from ever existing in the first place, and had failed, twice now, against two entirely different threats, because a woman with indigo-stained hands had refused, both times, to let anyone else write the ending to her own story. 3 weeks later, the formal announcement went out across every business publication in Seoul that director Baek Sung-ho had resigned his position on the Baekho Group's founding council amid an ongoing forensic investigation into financial irregularities dating back a decade, and that the council had unanimously reaffirmed its full and complete support for Chairman Lee Tae-hyun's leadership and for the legitimate standing of his son and heir, Kian Lee. The story generated considerably less attention than the scandal 6 months earlier, partly because the Baekho Group's communications team had learned valuable lessons about controlling a narrative before the press could shape it themselves, and partly because, as it turned out, a story about an elderly businessman's quiet financial fraud simply didn't carry the same emotional weight as a story about a mafia heir publicly choosing his son over an arranged marriage on the steps of his own headquarters. Chairman Oh Byung-chul, reached for comment by one particularly persistent reporter, offered a brief statement that surprised absolutely everyone who remembered how coldly formal he had once been about the collapsed engagement. The Baekho Group appears to be in capable hands, he said. More capable, perhaps, than some of its oldest members deserved credit for believing. His daughter, Oh Soo-min, now happily engaged to a cardiologist she had met entirely on her own terms the previous year, sent Naomi a brief, warm text message a few days later that simply read, Glad the right people ended up running that whole mess. Tell Kian I said the tomatoes sound impressive. Han Mi-suk hosted a small dinner at the family estate the following weekend, ostensibly to celebrate the council's decision. Though everyone present understood, it was really a celebration of something considerably larger. 7 years of separation finally, completely, permanently behind them. BC came, bringing a dish she insisted was an authentic Nigerian recipe and that Tae-hyun insisted, with genuine culinary confidence born from months of Naomi's cooking, was missing at least 2 crucial spices, an argument that ended, as most of their arguments seemed to end lately, with the two of them laughing too hard to actually finish the debate. Kian spent most of the dinner attempting to teach Mochi to sit, using a training method he had apparently researched extensively on his tablet, with limited but earnest success, while Han Mi-suk watched him with an expression of such open, unguarded affection that Tae-hyun, catching sight of his mother's face across the garden, felt something settle permanently into place that had been unsettled since the day, 7 years earlier, she had asked Naomi a single icy question meant as a warning. "You know," Han Mi-suk said quietly, joining Tae-hyun where he stood near the koi pond, watching his son fail, cheerfully, to convince a small dog of anything at all. "I spent 7 years believing I had done the right thing, protecting this family from complications I didn't understand. It took nearly losing that boy to a kidnapping attempt, and then nearly losing this entire company to a man I trusted for 30 years, before I finally understood that the complications I was so afraid of were never actually the threat. The threat was always the people willing to exploit our fear of them." "You couldn't have known that 7 years ago," Tae-hyun said. "No," his mother agreed. "But I know it now, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left, making certain that boy grows up knowing his grandmother chose to learn that lesson, rather than simply accepting it happened to be true." Later that evening, as the dinner wound down and Kian, exhausted from an entire afternoon of dog training attempts and second helpings of BC's disputed recipe, finally fell asleep against Naomi's shoulder in the quiet garden, Tae-hyun found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the particular strangeness of his own life. A man who had once been feared across an entire underworld for his stillness, his control, his complete inability to be surprised by anything, now sitting in a garden watching his sleeping son and his wife, and his slowly, imperfectly healing mother, and feeling, more than anything else, simply grateful. "Penny for your thoughts," Naomi said quietly, careful not to wake Kian. "I was thinking about the ring," Tae-hyun admitted. "The one I dropped on the sidewalk that first night. I never did figure out what happened to it." "Tae-hyun still has it," Naomi said, with the small, amused smile she reserved for exactly these kinds of revelations. "He mentioned it a few months ago. Apparently he's been keeping it in a drawer at his apartment this entire time because, and I'm quoting him directly, it felt disrespectful to just throw away $40,000 of diamond regardless of what it was originally for." Tae-hyun laughed, quietly, so as not to wake his son. "That sounds exactly like something Tae-hyun would say. What do you want to do with it?" Naomi asked. Tae-hyun considered the question for a long moment, looking down at his sleeping son, at the woman beside him, who had rebuilt an entire life, twice out of nothing but stubbornness and indigo dye, at the garden around them that had nearly witnessed a kidnapping, and instead now hosted family dinners with disputed Nigerian recipes and a dog who refused to learn basic commands. "I think," he said finally, "we should have it reset. Something smaller. Something that isn't attached to a marriage neither of us wanted. Meant to end a war that only ever mattered because 2 families were too proud to find peace any other way. Something new. That means something we actually chose." Naomi looked at him, something soft and unguarded moving across her face in the fading evening light. That sounds like exactly the right thing to do with it. I'll call Tae-hyun in the morning, Tae-hyun said. Though I suspect he's going to be personally offended that we're taking away his $40,000 responsibility. He'll survive, Naomi said. He's had 6 months of practice, surviving considerably worse than losing custody of a ring. They sat together in the quiet garden a while longer, Kian sleeping peacefully between them. Han Mi-suk's laughter drifting occasionally from where she sat, with Bisi and Tae-hyun still gently arguing about spices. And Tae-hyun thought, watching the koi move in slow, unhurried circles beneath the water's surface, that this, precisely this, ordinary and hard-won and entirely undramatic, was the exact thing his father had spent 30 years building an empire in hopes of eventually protecting, and had never quite managed to find for himself. He had found it instead, by accident, on a sidewalk in Gangnam, 7 years after he lost it the first time, and he had no intention, not now, not ever again, of letting anyone or anything take it from him without the fight of his entire life standing in the way. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you wish this story could keep going, it can. The Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories, created especially for true Afro-Korean romance fans. Click the link in the description, or simply scan the QR code by pausing the video and opening your phone's camera to get instant access in just a few moments. I can't wait for you to discover your next favorite love story. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us writing it, do us a favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Drop a like on this video and tell us in the comments which moment from today hit you hardest, because we read every single comment, and honestly, stories like this only keep coming because of you.